the probabilities of the prophecy fulfillment. Today I'm going to talk about climate change. For me, I came to my faith through the fulfilled prophecies. Having a background in statistics, I knew that the probability of the number 500 of them being fulfilled it couldn't have happened by chance. And to me, then that makes the Bible the true Word of God, and everything in it is His Word. So things like an age of 6,000 years versus 4.5 billion years for the planet. There's a lot of scientific work that supports this 6,000 years. Climate change. There's some comments about the climate and the earth in itself in the Bible. Genesis 8:22 says, "While the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease." Okay, 2 Peter 3:10 says, "But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat, and the earth also and the works that are therein shall be burned up." God has a plan for the climate and the earth and as well as the other things. So the question is that, do we need to worry about climate change? And what I'm going to do today is, first I'm going to go over some of the proponents of climate change and some of the claims that they're making. Then I'll go over the facts. What are the scientific facts? And finally I'll tell you what they're really after. Most supposedly they're not worried about the climate per se. And at the end I have a number of references. If you're interested in this topic, a couple of really good books on the subject that will give you information on climate and the change. Okay, do climates change? They do. Both secular scientists and creationists agree that climates do change. But the real question isn't whether they change, but is man causing it, and does it matter? Many secular individuals and scientists believe that human activity, like burning fossil fuels, since the day of the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, is causing Earth's temperature to rise. They further believe that if we don't bring it down soon, the Earth and everything living on it is doomed. In reality, climate change is a greenhouse effect, and the important mechanism by which the Earth remains, for the most part, comfortably warm, cozy, and livable, and also pretext for the advancement of doomsday prediction of carbon dioxide driven global warming. If we didn't have greenhouse gases, if we didn't have an atmosphere, the planet would be unlivable. That's part of God's plan, and you'll see that in a second. The doomsday guys in the lower left like to show this picture, that climate change is leading to the destruction of the earth, basically. Fossil fuel is God's fuel. I mean, it was provided by God. It's the most efficient fuel that we have. It's abundant. Every time someone makes a claim that we're going to run out of it, when that time arises, we actually have more than they found. Most of the oil was formed when the flood occurred, and we covered up massive amounts of plant material and turned into oil. Okay, climate change. Is it responsible for more severe weather, more severe storms? Is it responsible for wildfires, more wildfires, especially in California? Are the polar bears facing extinction? You frequently see ads on TV that say, we're getting fewer and fewer polar bears and the ice is melting. Is the sea level rising? to the point that we have to worry about that rise. And is it responsible for the droughts that we see, an increase in the hot weather? And those are the issues that I'm going to address. Let's first talk about what global warming is and the greenhouse effect and how it occurs. You get radiation coming through our atmosphere. Our atmosphere is about 6,000 feet thick, 6,000 miles thick, and it's comprised of 5 layers. Okay, and the radiation comes through. About 30% of it is immediately reflected back out of our atmosphere, but that reaches the Earth is reflected off of the Earth and hits these greenhouse gases. The major ones I'm showing: CO2, carbon dioxide, methane, and water. And once the radiation hits those greenhouse gases, they radiate heat, and that keeps the planet warm and cozy. But look at the relative amounts of those different gases. The greenhouse gas, CO2, is 400 parts per million, about 0.04%. Methane, about 1.7 parts per million. By far, the largest greenhouse gas that we have in the atmosphere is water vapor. I put up here 90%, but it's really closer to 99%. And this is God's plan, really. I mean, having an atmosphere makes the planet livable. One of the things that makes it livable. You might wonder, why do we keep the atmosphere? We're spinning around. Why doesn't the atmosphere just go off into space entirely? And that's gravity. Gravity actually not only holds the atmosphere, but holds the whole universe together. And again, that's something that God's given us. That if the gravity constants were just slightly different, again, the planet would be inhabitable. Okay, the other thing I wanted to show here in the upper right corner, this is the moon, and it shows you what we would have if we didn't have an atmosphere. The moon doesn't have an atmosphere. And when it's facing the sun, it'll reach temperatures of 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And on the other side, it'll reach temperatures of minus 328 degrees Fahrenheit. So without the atmosphere, without the greenhouse effect, we would see those kinds of temperatures as well. Another thing I wanted to point up here, there's a lot of stuff on here. I'm not going to go over it, but a lot. But CO2 and oxygen is a cycle that God's created, that we breathe out CO2, plants take in CO2 through their leaves, and use the CO2 with energy to create glucose and give off oxygen. So they're giving off oxygen, taking in CO2, giving off oxygen. We're taking in the oxygen and giving off CO2. And that's a cycle but what most people don't know, most people that are tree huggers are worried about the trees cutting down because that's where our CO2 is coming from. But more than 50% of the plant life that's cycling CO2 is in the ocean, phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are single-cell plant organisms that occur in the top 300 feet of the ocean, and they're very important to this whole cycle. They also fix carbon. They live for about a day. They're single cell. Then they die and fall to the bottom of the ocean and basically generate carbon down there and just recycle carbon. Another thing and as a scientist, and I started addressing these issues, I get interested in questions. Most people don't realize that the amount of water on this planet is constant. Okay, the number of water molecules on this planet is constant. Okay, it just gets cycled goes from the ocean to the clouds, into the rivers, back into the ocean. We drink water. We're 60% of a body is water. The only way that we take in water is through comet strikes, can sometimes bring water with them. So water is key to the greenhouse effect as well, as I said. Okay, I wanted to show you, this is a typical slide that the media will produce and talk about a global emergency climate. And what they're doing is looking at a data set. The real world is this down here at the bottom, but they're just showing the top part of it to accentuate the change that they see. Okay, and that's a common way to display biased data, and you'll see them doing that in a lot of different.
So what they did, they changed the scale on the y-axis.
Yeah. The other thing that's interesting, we have not had an accurate measurement of the surface temperature of the Earth until we started taking measurements by satellite 45 years ago. So we've got the very good data from 45 years ago forward, and everything else that's generated is questionable. Like this data goes back to 1890. A lot of that data will be questionable, but most of the data that's being used and presented is based on models that's been generated from data taken in from the last 45 years. And they'll go back hundreds of years based on that, and that's has its own problems set. And this, at the bottom here, I show actually a website that at any time you can put that on and find out what the surface temperature of the Earth is from that satellite feed. Okay, now let's talk about what they're claiming, and I'll lay most of this on Al Gore. Al Gore is a politician, as you know. His training is in government, not in science. When you're not trained in science, even though anybody can read a science book, but if you're not trained in science, you don't know how to ask the right questions, you don't know how to develop experiments, you don't know how to understand the reliability of the data that you're getting. So basically, he made a number of claims, and any of you guys that are in the business of forecasting, whatever, you never want to tack a date on it, which is a mistake that he made. He said that climate change is the biggest challenge our civilization faces. And he said that shortly, he said within, let's see up here, within about a decade, the Arctic ice would disappear. And and truth of the matter is, not only is the Arctic ice not disappearing, it's growing. So he made a number of statements about different aspects of climate.
That was supposed to happen in 2013.
Yeah. He said the snows of Kilimanjaro would disappear in a few years, and we've had 30 years since he made those statements, and it has more snow and it's growing than it had at the time he made the statement. He said that the hurricanes that we're having, they were having more and more of them, and it's due to climate change, but the actual data, as cited by the Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, made this statement. They conclude that the historical Atlantic hurricane data at this stage do not provide compelling evidence for a substantial greenhouse warming induced increase in frequency. Okay, in fact, shortly after Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, a British judge came out a year later and said there were 9 important statements that he made that were factual errors, and that his movie shouldn't be presented to school children until those errors were created. Correct. Okay, he said in his book, Earth in the Balance, 60% of the population of Florida would have to be relocated. He wrote that in '92. And the population of Florida, as you know, has just increased. We've not had an increasing water problem on the coast.
So he was saying all this would happen in 30 years?
Yeah.
And you said that in 1992?
He said it, he wrote it in '92. And he said that there were 10 million people in Bangladesh that would lose their homes and means of sustenance because of a rising sea level. And their land has also increased above sea level.
But he's made millions with those claims.
He's made, his net worth is $300 million. And here, I'm not going to go into this data, but what it's showing is the growth of the Arctic ice, and how the x-axis here is by month, and it shows how it varies during the time of the year. And of course, it does melt during the summer a little bit and freezes again in the winter. And the lower right-hand graph shows that situation over various times in historical times. And they're all within the standard deviations of the measurements, within the variability of the measurements. So the Arctic ice is not disappearing. And the statement he makes that it'll be entirely gone by the summer of 2014. And again, if you're going to make these kind of statements, write these kind of books, you need to be vague about the time, because you're always going to be wrong. And he said that the streets, that New York would be underwater as well by 2015, and of course it's a vibrant city, it remains. Okay, the graphs, the data on the right, I put up here because this is what started in 1966 and has gone forward. Several scientists periodically say we're going to run out of oil, and it shows the oil production down at the bottom over time, and oil becomes more accessible. There's more of it. They make the prediction, and when the time comes, there's always been more than the time when they made the prediction. You probably remember Greta Thunberg. She quoted a scientist, a top climate scientist, that said that climate change would wipe out humanity in less than 5 years. And she did that in 2018. So again, you got alarmists, and for the most part, the people that are on the forefront of doing it are not scientists. Okay, they're trying to use the media to direct public action. Okay, in fact, this was published in 2023. There's 1,600 scientists, including two Nobel Prize winners, that say climate change is not a crisis and it's a hoax. And they're from all fields of science. It says the modern climate change movement is actually a religion that believes that man can save himself and save the planet. The atmospheric and climate, they're complex, but God, who made it all, thoroughly understands it. We don't need to fear that man will destroy the planet, as God wouldn't let that happen anyway. So climate change is really not the issue that these guys would make it out to be. And this is a good point too. This is what a scientist does. This was John Clauser, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 2022. He said, "I don't believe there is a climate crisis. The world we live in today is filled with misinformation. It is up to each of you to serve as judges, distinguishing truth from falsehood based on accurate observations of phenomena." You don't want to blindly accept what the media is projecting or what politicians are saying either. And this stuff is easy enough to check out for yourself. Okay, I'll spend a few minutes on this one. This shows, this data, again, temperature has only been accurately measured for the last 45 years. This goes back 10,000 years, so they say, and it's based on the core samples taken from Greenland. Greenland has an ice cap that's 10,000 feet thick, and they can take a core sample, and I show the core, a core portion of it up here in the, let's see if I can move this around, up in here. That's a core sample, and it's in layers, much like a tree is in layers. And they make the assumption that every layer is due to a year. It goes through a summer and a winter, and it forms layers. So they've gone through, let's see, let me do this. Well, I've got some verbiage up there that if you get the PowerPoint slide, you can open up and look at it. But basically, they've gone through all 10,000 feet and counted the layers and come up with the statement that said, okay, this covers over 100,000 years. And the interesting thing is that there's a point of reference in Greenland. In 1941, we were ferrying planes to Europe, and a squadron of P-38s ran into bad weather, and they landed in a remote snowbank in Greenland, and left their planes there. There were 6 of them, and walked or found their way to civilization. But the planes stayed there. In 1980, about 50 years later, I guess about 50 years later, some individuals decided to go back and see if they could get one of those planes and bring them back. And they expected to go there and see the back fin of the plane sticking out of the snow. But the plane itself was now encased, it was 300 feet deep in the ice. And they did dig it out and resurrect the plane. But what that tells you is, based on the way scientists are looking at the aging criteria, that plane should have been 2,500 years old. And it was, only about 45 years old. And that's a problem when you look at all of the methodology that we're using to measure age of events, be it rocks with an isotope method, or the change in the amino acid optical activity. Though those are accurate measurements, they still have a lot of assumptions embedded in them. No one is alive that's been back there that could say, okay, this is the actual occurrence. But just generally, if you look at the graph, there have been times in this country, in this world, when the temperatures have been hotter. Okay, and the red line shows how CO2 has been increasing, and to the point that there's a statistical difference, a statistical increase, and that, as you find out, is actually good for vegetation. Okay, I went back and got some data out of newspapers. These newspapers are, the one on the left was from Shelby County in Missouri, and was posted in 1905, and it's listing dates in which there had been droughts and that were significant enough to kill lots of people. In fact, in the year 1123, the German Rhine River dried up. In 1303, 1304, they dried up again. Okay, and in 1821, the heat was so great that more than 200,000 people died from heat in France. And on the right, it's again a newspaper article from this country, from I don't know, the Riviera Recorder, published in 1899, but again cites droughts that we've had in the past. In fact, the most significant droughts the world has seen has occurred in history, not they're less frequent today, as you'll see. Okay, the media's narrative. Okay, you'll see this is an article at the bottom that was posted in the Texas A&M Today, their magazine. It was posted in 2024, and they said Texans should prepare for hotter temperatures, greater risk of fire and flooding. Now, if you look at what the graph is showing is the number of days above 100, the number of days above 100 degrees. And the bars are 5-year averages of that data. And you can see that that in the earlier years, and it goes back to 1904, but the first half of the century was much warmer than the second half. There is the outlier data point in 2014, but by and large, the data is not showing that the temperatures are getting hotter in Texas. Okay, this was a Wall Street Journal article written in this year, I think, too, that said that crops are going to fail because of the heat, because of climate change, global warming, and that coffee in particular was going to die out. Well, what the graph shows is from 1961 to 2022, the coffee production in various parts of the world, in South America and Asia, and in Europe. Okay, and as you'll see, in most vegetation, when they do this type of study, it's actually increasing. You know, because of the CO2. The more CO2 that a plant has, the bigger that it's going to grow, the more productive it's going to be.
Of course, you're only talking about 0.004%.
Yeah, I'm talking about 300 parts per million or so, 400 parts per million. It's riddled with dishonesty and incompetence as well, and I'll read a couple of these. This is what they're really after. None of these guys are scientists, none of these guys are women, but Tim Wirth, the former U.S. Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs and the person most responsible for setting up the Kyoto Protocol, said, "We've got to ride the global warming issue. Even if the theory of global warming is wrong, we will be doing the right thing in terms of economic policy and environmental policy." And I'll show one over here too. The Christina Stewart of Canada's Foreign Minister of the Environment said, "No matter if the science is all phony, there are collateral environmental benefits. Climate change, the greatest chance to bring about justice and equality in the world." Okay, and basically, again, Al Gore said that we could expect to see a 20-foot rise in sea level in a very short time. But the current rate of sea level rise is about, well, it would take, at the current level, would take 1,800 years to reach 20 feet. I'm going to talk more about the sea level changes. Here are the facts. And this is available you know, on the internet, very easily found. Lots of references. Okay. This was crop production. As I showed before, crop production is improving with time as the CO2 levels have increased slightly. Okay, in fact, now that was for, this is for crops that this was a controlled experiment in which they increased the level of CO2 by 300 parts per million. Okay, that's basically doubling what it has right now. And then they looked at 549 plant species and looked at their yield over a growing season. And every one of them, you know, the top one is carrots. The yield increased by 77%. You know, just a host of plant life. They're all benefiting from increased CO2 levels. Drought. Okay, the graph here shows the green is the number of very wet days, and the brown is very dry days. And as you can look at that, and it goes back to, can't really see the date here, but it goes back quite a few years. And the point is that that neither is very different from the historic range. You know, and again, the statement that they make here is that the United States has benefited from additional precipitation and a reduction in the drought conditions in the climate as the climate has warmed a bit. So drought really is not an issue either. How about storms? The graph on the far left goes back to 1970, and the top is plotting the number of tropical storms, the bottom the number of hurricanes. The graph to the right of that is the number of tornadoes, and they're not increasing with global warming either. If you look at the number of wildland fires in the United States and the acreage that has been burned, much more in the early part of the century than we're seeing now. Most wildfires, as you know, are due to poor management process, not getting rid of the undergrowth. In California, makes it very susceptible to fires. Okay, what about poor polar bears? Okay, in 1950 there were, I'll go with the top. In 1950 there were about 5,000 polar bears. In 2022 there's 20,000. They're growing as well. So that's another line. Now I want to talk about the ice mass itself. Polar land-bound ice is primarily in Antarctica, has 90% of it, and Greenland has the other 10%. Okay, and this was a publication to the left that I cite there that was looking at the growth of ice in the Antarctica over the last 85 years. And this was recently published too in 2024. And what they're looking at is comparing photographs taken 85 years ago with today's photographs, and using mountain ranges as the key points to measure change. And what they found that both Greenland and Antarctica, the land ice is growing. Okay. Now the interesting thing is, when you look at ice, there's two types of ice. There's ice on the land and there's ice in the water. Okay, think of an iceberg. The ice in the water is actually less dense than the water itself, and that's why it floats. Okay, when an iceberg melts, the sea level doesn't rise. Okay, there's a little bit sticking above the sea level of the water, but when the whole thing melts, because this is what's submerged is less dense, it occupies less space and covers what's melting on the top. So you won't see any sea level rise when sea ice melts. Okay, and that's not true with land ice. Land ice, if it melts in Antarctica, if Antarctica were to melt, then what you would see is the level of water would change. In fact, if it completely melted, then you would see the whole Earth would have an increase in water level of about 230 feet. But the land ice is not melting. Okay, in fact, it's expanding.
See, if the Antarctic ice melts, wouldn't the sea level drop?
No, because it's on land. You know, as opposed to the Arctic, which has water underneath, and the sea ice itself, as far as there's 4/3 the amount of sea ice as there is land ice. So there's much more sea ice there, and all ice, as you go through the seasons, will melt and re-solidify as the seasons change. Okay, this shows that how the sea level around New York has changed over the last century. And what it's showing is that in a century you could have seen about a little less than a foot growth in the height of the sea. Again, it would take like 1,800 years to meet Al Gore's criteria.
And the reason for that's happening is because there's more ice being formed underwater in the Antarctic.
Yeah, probably. It's also within the experimental measurement era. I wanted to show this. If Carla was going to be here, I would show this. I wanted to show this slide to her in particular. This makes the point about sea ice and land ice. But you can actually run an experiment, as shown on the left at the bottom, where you have two containers, food containers, and some clay, and you can build a little reef with the clay on the edge, and then take ice, let's say 10 ice cubes, and put it in not on the clay in one of them, and on the surface of the container in the other, but not on the clay, and then fill it up with water to the level of the clay. And what you'll find is that the level on the right doesn't change as the ice melts, but the level on the left does. And again, that's land. The ice is coming off the land and adding to the volume of the water. And when the ice is in the water, because it's less dense than the liquid water, it floats. If it weren't that way, then what you would have, the oceans would be frozen. You know, if the ice were heavier and fell to the bottom, gradually you'd build on it and it would solidify the whole thing. That's again part of God's plan and the cycles. But this can be done in school, which is kind of an interesting experiment.
So what you're saying is water ice does not add to the height of the ocean?
It doesn't, David. Yeah, because it basically occupies, when it's liquid, it occupies less space. Yeah, because it's less dense. Now, what's the reason for all of this, all of these claims? And this is the interesting. The reason is to get a one world government. Basically, and this is Amir's statement, Clint, according to the proponents of global warming, the Earth is on a downward slide toward destruction, with man-made carbon emissions being the greatest culprit. Because this is not a localized climate emergency, allowing each country to determine its own course of action, a global problem demands global oversight. And that was the basis in 1997 of the Kyoto Protocol, where 190 countries came up and gave up some of their sovereignty to solve this problem. And then the Paris Agreement in 2015 committed hundreds of billions of dollars to solving the problem, and committed 196 countries. And this is the agreement that Trump walked away from. because Trump, again, he's not a scientist either, but he has access to this kind of information and an unbiased opinion by a scientist. That when you have a motive that you're trying to drive, even though you have access to those same unbiased scientists, you want to hear scientists that support your point of view, and so you search them out.
Discount the rest.
Yeah. 2015, President Barack Obama declared that climate change would be the single greatest threat to future generations. Okay, and the Catholic Church, the Pope Francis, has taken a stand on climate change as a key component of the spiritual platform. In June of 2015, he called for the creation of a global authority that would tackle the challenge of reducing pollution and climate heat change. Then in September, the Pope pronounced that committing a crime against the natural world is a sin against God. And again, this is these have ulterior political motives, but climate change is not the problem that most people think it is. You know, and it's easily our population is easily swayed by the media, so it's been a good thing that the media is shown to be biased in what they publish, and they're losing their credibility. And that's important. I know if Trump's elected again, he'll walk away from that agreement again. The money they're spending on that they want the United Nations to control, is not money well spent. I've just got a couple more slides. And conclusion: climate change is not an immediate problem. In fact, slight increases in CO2 are beneficial. The plant growth has been demonstrated, and if you look at the economics of over time, due to the increased CO2 levels, it's astounding how much it's added to the economics of that. Here's some of the resources that I use. The Heartland Org is an organization made up of scientists and economists that are educating countries, the management of countries, the leadership in countries in Europe, and pulling together data to support these positions so they can make educated policy on climate. They've changed in Austria, they changed their direction completely. And they're making this information available to everybody. This data is extreme. This book, especially 30 Prominent Climate Topics, is excellent. It was put out by them. The Climate Changes for Kids is that was written by Ken Ham, and that's a great book as well. And it basically lots of pictures showing how the points that I've made.
What was the name of that one?
Do what?
What was the one by Ken Ham?
Climate change for kids.
Yeah, Climate Change for Kids, written by Ken Ham. This is also a good site. What's up with that? They address a number of topics. You can see the lower left. One is on climate change and what's going on in that world of policy.
So it's indoctrination. They're indoctrinating the school kids to be afraid or scared of climate change.
Yeah.
And when they grow up, then they won't have
And,
government attack the problem.
and that's the same thing that they're doing with evolution and all of those topics that are indoctrinating them from all the way through college. I put this in here because this is a novel that touches on climate change as part of the story. And I've not read it, but it looks interesting. So, again, science doesn't back the arguments for climate change as an immediate problem. It's not money well spent. If we did something, I'm not sure we could do anything. I mean, about it. We can limit the emissions of cars. We could go to ostriches for meat rather than cows. That's where Clint, the methane's coming from. Ostriches don't pass gas, it's methane, so, because they don't ruminate. But it's and the whole key here, the world is better off using fossil fuel than these non-renewable resources, especially in low-income countries. And their way of life is better supported with fossil fuel and not the expense of these other things. But you know, this is a battle that will be constantly fought, and it's all about money and whether you want the United Nations to pull these countries together and lead to one world government.
Mainly they want to take money away from the developed countries and give it to the
Yeah,
under.
they want to redistribute the wealth, right? But after they take a big chunk of it.
Yeah. One chart that would be beneficial would be look at the man-made CO2 over time, back to when we burned wood and
Yeah.
coal to generate, and now they're trying to stop us from using natural gas, but natural gas actually reduces CO2 as to other mechanisms,
Yeah,
unless you leave out nuclear, which they're trying to. The use of natural gas is the most beneficial thing you could do to CO2.
Yeah.
And they're trying to ban it.
And you
It
can
makes
look at
no
the,
sense at all.
you can look at the ecological generation of CO2 versus industry CO2 generation. And they're minuscule.
They
Yeah,
say it's a man-made problem, but man does not contribute to CO2 levels. We're reducing by the ways we use energy as opposed to the way it was used in the 1900s and 1800s.
and the other thing, David, is that it's not a problem. CO2 is good to certain levels. I mean, now you could probably
But
get,
I'm arguing against their argument that
yeah,
CO2 levels is what's causing the problem. You're saying there's no problem, and I'm saying there's no CO2 increases.
there is CO2 increases, but
But
over,
man-made
yeah,
CO2 increases.
yeah. But all this is God's plan with these cycles. It makes the planet habitable, you know. And for me, I struggle with God has a plan. It's all written out. So whatever you do doesn't make any difference.
Amen.
You know, it's what's going to happen. But the longer you can extend things, the more souls you can save, basically. What, you know, with Linda out there every day giving eggs away,
Yeah, attracting people.
that's what she's doing.
Yeah, what really struck me was they were interviewing this idiot that's in charge of Department of Transportation, and he's trying to say that electric vehicles are 90% efficient. Well, Kennedy asked him, well, how did they make the electricity that went into the electric vehicle? And
Yeah,
he wouldn't even address that as an issue. He said, no, electric vehicles are 90% efficient. You're bringing up something that we don't want to touch,
yeah,
which is how do you make the electricity and how do you transmit the electricity? And if you look at round trip efficiency for electric vehicles, they're probably worse than ICE engines,
yeah.
unless we had a mechanism for generating and transmitting electricity better than what we do today.
And another issue is with the batteries in the car. It has lithium and cobalt can't be, there's a limited amount of it. It's not renewable.
Plus, it makes cracks in the roads because the car's so heavy with all the batteries.
Yeah. It's, you don't really need, I can see the disadvantage of having fossil fuels in Los Angeles and the
Yes.
smog and stuff that they get, but planet-wide, it's not an issue. And it's there, it's part of God's cycle.
Oh, I know. It's so
You know,
cool.
it's,
Of course, as you pointed out, to begin with, all of this is for a purpose, for control, one world government.
Yeah.
It's either COVID, it's global warming, it's
Exactly.
something.
You can look at the smog levels in London in the 1800s compared to today. It was because they were burning wood and coal.
With no abatement system.
But
No
it
abatement.
wasn't, it isn't greater today because of an ice vehicle. It was much greater then because of the way they generated the heat. They used coal and wood, which is horrible.
Of course, we talk about CO2, but it's not only CO2, there's other things like nitrous oxide. It's about 100 times greater in absorbing heat than CO2. But they put it on the equivalent of CO2 equivalents. But anyway, the ultimate goal is control the people, don't believe in God, don't believe the scriptures.
Burn your Bible.
We heard a guy the other night, gave a real good testimony, Fernando, you probably know him.
Oh, yeah.
He gave an excellent testimony, and he was going to his church and whatnot, and he started reading his Bible. And that's a mistake if you go to a church. He's reading his Bible. He's saying, hey man, this is not what I've been taught. The Bible says such and such. And he confronted the preacher, and of course the preacher finally told him, don't come back. Because you don't come back, because you're stirring the pot. But it's a scripture. So what's the scripture say? So that was the authority. But people don't want the scripture to be the authority. They want to be the authority. And they want to tell you about climate change and everything else, which is a method of controlling and getting to the one part.
And you learn the truth from Eric.
Yeah, he listened. He said, Eric, he got rightly divided from Eric Newman.
Good point.
Anyway, thanks, guys, that's all I have.
Very good.
That was
See,
great.
Larry, you got any comment?